Darkcast Network. Come to the dark side of indie podcasts.
On Wiki Travel, the Pacific Northwest is best known for its beautiful coastline, green interior, rainy weather, and spectacular mountains. But because of all this, it's also the perfect place to go missing. My name's Carmita, and I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in Portland, Oregon. I host a podcast called Missing in the PNW. My podcast is different from others you may have heard because I focus specifically on two things. The first is that all of the missing person cases that I cover are strictly from the Pacific Northwest in Oregon and Washington. I know, the title of my podcast should have given that one away. The second thing is that my podcast focuses strictly on missing persons from marginalized communities, such as the Black, Hispanic, Native American and Indigenous people, and the LGBTQ plus communities. You know, the ones that get absolutely no media attention. Now, I am not an investigative journalist or a reporter. I'm actually a widowed mom of 3 who loves true crime and has a passion for social justice. So join me in helping to spread the word on these missing person cases and help be the voice for the ones that are now voiceless. You can find Missing in the PNW on all of the major streaming apps, as well as on socials at Missing in the PNW podcast. If you have a case you want me to cover, please email me at missinginthepnw@gmail.com or send me a message through Facebook Messenger. I hope to talk to you soon. And remember, have fun, but be safe.
Hey everyone, welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host Cindy, and I'm glad you're here. Hey guys, I'm back. I'm a week late. I apologize. I feel like life is never going to get slower or easier, so I just have to find a way. So I'm back. I've got another crazy case for you. I couldn't find any more Halloween ones that really spoke to me or would be more than like a 5-minute, story. So instead I decided to choose a story that is just absolutely fucking horrific. It could be a horror movie, and it's the things that nightmares are made of. This week, we're going to delve into the story of Theresa Knorr. Now, this woman is one of the worst mothers probably ever, and that's saying something because we all know there's a lot of horrible stories about horrible mothers, but she's really up there. And as always, this is also a story about how the systems have failed children, have failed those in need, and are basically just set up to fail, which is really fucked. So let's get into it. I'm hiding in my room. If you hear dog's footsteps, I apologize. I have a bulldog, and he is the laziest walker. Every time he walks, his feet slap, and it's so loud. So I was trying to record in my living room, but I had to actually come hide in here from him because anytime he gets up to walk, it's I don't know, it sounds like water sloshing in a bucket or like somebody painting with a metal paintbrush. I don't know. It's insane. So anyway, happy October, everybody. Best month of the year. Also busiest for me for work. And we just moved. So I apologize. I'm not more consistent, but we're going to get there. I'm back. Here we are. True Crime California. Let's go. So this is, like I said, the story of Theresa Knorr. And we're actually going to start with her birth and her young life. She was born Theresa Jimmy Francine Cross to Swanee and Jim Cross, who apparently thought they were only ever going to have one baby, and that baby needed to be named after Jim. So that was Theresa's name, Theresa Jimmy, which I actually think is really cute, but a lot of people call it out because it's kind of funny. Now, she was born March 14th, 1946 in Sacramento, California. Her mother, Swanee, was on her second marriage with Jim and convinced him to marry her by promising to give him a son. Now, Swanee was desperate to get married as her first husband died of illness, leaving her with 2 young children, a boy and a girl. Her next husband, Jim, only wanted a boy and thought girls weren't worth the time or effort whatsoever. Now, what's really cool about that is that he and Swanee went on to have 2 girls and no boys. So first they had Theresa, then after Theresa came her younger sister, Rosemary. Now, as I had mentioned, Swanee had a boy from a previous marriage, and this boy, I believe his name was Robert, could do no wrong in his parents' eyes. Jim loved him far more than he loved Theresa or Rosemary, and allowed this boy to get away with anything and everything. And meanwhile, anytime the girls would literally breathe too loud, they would be belittled and berated and otherwise completely ignored. So we're definitely setting a tone here that is very detrimental to all children in the household. It's terrible for the son as he's learning that, his shit don't stink and he can get away with anything, but also to not value women at all. And it's terrible for the daughters because they're also learning not to value themselves. And it gets even worse, really, because even though Jim didn't really care for either of his daughters, he was much, much nicer to and clearly favored Theresa because she was the thinner, prettier of his two daughters. So now Theresa's learning this really fucked up value system from basically the moment she's born. And this also, of course, creates animosity between the children, and especially Theresa and Rosemary, because instead of being mad at their parents for the way they're treating them, they find each other to be competition. So they're competing with each other for their parents' approval. They're not competing with the brother because he's so high above them and he's obviously of more value. So the two of them are fighting amongst themselves for scraps, which is a really fucked up way to be. Now, because their father wanted so little to do with them, Theresa and Rosemary spent much more time with their mother, Swanee, and Theresa and her mother were particularly close, because I should note that Swanee echoed her husband's sentiments about the girls in general and Rosemary in particular. So Theresa and her mother were super, super close, at least until her mother died in her arms when Theresa was 16 years old. They were out shopping and her mother collapsed in her arms and died of like a heart condition, which that's really, really going to fuck a person up. But especially coming from this kind of background, to have the one person who you think values you, even if it's for really fucked up reasons, literally die in your arms is fucking horrific. And as you can imagine, this completely destroyed Theresa. Like, she totally freaks out and she doesn't want to stay home, with her piece of shit dad. And because of the way she was raised, she figures the only way out is to get married. And by the way, at this time, her father had been diagnosed with Parkinson's and had lost his job. He was an assistant cheesemaker, by the way, which is fucking random as hell. But he lost his job and was also like taking this out on the family. So she was like, no way do I want to stay here and live with this man. So at the ripe old age of 16, she finds herself a man, Clifford Clyde Sanders. We're going to call him CC Sanders, who I think is 5 years her senior, and they get married pretty much right away. And right after that, Theresa finds herself pregnant with her first child. This is a boy, which I'm sure she was very happy about, who was born in 1963, less than a year after the couple were married, and while she is barely 17. Now, shortly after having this son, Howard, Theresa was again pregnant, as I think she thought this was the only way to keep a man, which was obviously behavior modeled by her mother. Anyway, so the marriage was awful, as you can imagine, with Theresa being extremely jealous, likely as a result of having absolutely no self-worth thanks to her horrible upbringing. And as a result of that, she was always accusing Cece of cheating on her. And after a pretty short while, obviously, less than a year, her second baby isn't even born yet, he told Theresa he's leaving her. She did not like this, and the two got into a terrible fight. Now, this fight took place on July 6th, 1964, and just 2 weeks prior to this, on June 22nd, 1964, Theresa had reported Cece to the police for punching her in the face. Now, when police offered, she chose not to press charges, which makes sense considering, that's something that happens a lot and really sucks. But what's interesting is just a few weeks later, on July 6th, they're arguing and Cece tells her, "I'm going to leave." And the next thing you know, he's been shot and falls down dead in their home. Theresa, barely 18 at this point, goes running to the neighbor's house for help, frantic and screaming, and the police come and find Cliff here dead, lying face down. Theresa claims she grabbed their rifle and shot him in self-defense, but police don't buy it, considering not only how he was positioned, but also because there were no powder burns on his skin, meaning he wasn't very close to her, like she had claimed. So she said, "He's coming at me, he's going to hit me, so I shot him." And police are like, he's across the room, he's face down, he has like a defensive bullet wound through his hand, and no powder burns. No fucking way is this self-defense. So she gets arrested. She's got an 11-month-old baby. She's pregnant as fuck, and she's on trial for murder. Now, she goes on trial, but Theresa, she's little, she's cute, she's pregnant, she's barely 18. So after a ton of back and forth, she is in fact found not guilty by way of self-defense. This as sus as fuck, but it's where we end up with this part of the story. So now Theresa is single, widowed, I guess, with a young child and another on the way, and she's desperate. So she starts frequenting a local American Legion hall, which is like a place where veterans hang out. It's like a bar but mostly for veterans, but like anybody can go there, but it's really like for them. And after the birth of her second child, Sheila Gay Sanders, in March of 1965, she begins drinking heavily while out prowling for a new man. Now, Theresa, like I said, she's desperate, and she finds herself a quadriplegic veteran who she takes advantage of, and they begin dating. Pretty quickly, this man, whose name is Estelle, by the way, which I found really interesting because that's like a lady's name. So we've got Estelle and Jimmy. Very weird. Anyway, pretty quickly he gets fed up because she's basically using him as a babysitter for her two kids while she goes out and gets wasted and sleeps with other men. And finally, Estelle cuts things off after finding out that Theresa was sleeping with his best friend, which, if nothing else, is a very bold move on her part. Now, shortly after this, she actually is able to secure herself another husband, Marine Private Robert Knorr. Now, really quickly, I want to call out that Theresa was very much following in her parents' footsteps by valuing her son far more than her daughter. There is no world in which Theresa was ever a good mother, but she did give Howard her best version of love, allowed him to cry, to need things, to hug her, to be a normal baby and child, and she reciprocated as much as her fucked up self was able to. But Sheila, on the other hand, was routinely beaten for crying, denied basic things, never given love, and it got to the point where apparently all Theresa had to do was give Sheila, who was not even 2 years old at this point, a death stare, and she would quiet down for fear of being hit. Super crazy shit. So now she has these two young children being treated very differently, but neither one being treated very well because she's going out drinking, leaving them with random men. But then she meets this guy, Robert, and they get married. And guess what? She gets pregnant again. The couple go on to have a total of 4 children together. Susan Knorr, whose name was spelled Suesan, very fucking weird. It was hard to look her up until I realized that. So Susan Knorr, born in 1966, William Robert Knorr, born in 1967, Robert Wallace Knorr, born in 1968, and Theresa Terry Knorr in 1970. So she used the name Robert twice and used her own name because on top of everything else, she's also not a very creative person. So despite constantly being knocked up, Theresa was convinced Robert was stepping out on her, a persistent theme with her husbands so far. And the two would fight constantly over her jealousy because, again, she has no sense of self-worth, so of course he's cheating because why wouldn't he, right? It's a really sad way to live. By 1971, after having children in super quick succession, the two were divorced. And Theresa was so angry about this that she did everything she could to make it basically impossible for Robert to see his children. And it pretty much worked. Like, he was basically out of the picture. She even moved up to Washington for a bit before coming back to California because she really didn't like it up there, which, like, I feel that. Anyway, from here, she meets yet another man, Ronald Pulliam, and they married, but divorced shortly after, like less than a year, because he got fed up with her leaving him with her now 6 kids while she went out to drink and party. Which, by the way, the drinking and partying was something she never stopped doing, even when she was married to Robert. So we have this really interesting pattern here. She finds a man that she seemingly likes, has his babies, accuses him of cheating, and then their relationship falls apart. He either gets murdered or they get divorced. Or I guess, and then she finds a man she's not super interested in, but wants for like stability and a paycheck, and leaves him with her children while she goes out and parties and cheats, which is really interesting. So we've had the husband that she has kids with, the veteran that she abused and used as a babysitter, the Robert who she got married and had 4 kids with, and now this husband who she's just using and abusing. So it's a really interesting pattern. And meanwhile, all the time, she's treating her children horribly, but always much kinder to the boys than the girls. Anyway, and this poor guy, he gets away from her, this Ronald Pulliam. He's basically just like a footnote in the story. And after him, Theresa finds yet another man to marry. This is a man named Chester Harris, who thankfully went by Chet. So Chet Harris here, luckily they don't have any kids together, because he really doesn't like kids, like at all. But this, of course, is not a deal breaker for Theresa, because she really also doesn't like kids, including her own, for sure. So the two get married, and again, things go sideways fast. First, Theresa finds that Chet is into witchcraft, while she is a woman of God, clearly. So that's a problem, of course. But what's worse is that despite Chet not liking kids, he forms a really strong bond with Susan, who at this time is only 10 years old. So just so we have it in order here, we've got Howard, Sheila, Susan, William, Robert, Terry. So Susan is her second youngest daughter, I think third youngest child, and only 10 years old at this time. But even at 10 years old, Susan is very pretty, very petite, very cute, and super smart. And Chet really enjoys talking to Susan, and Susan enjoys talking to Chet. They talk about religion, they talk about all sorts of deep ideas, and Theresa hates this because it threatens her, because she's in competition with her own daughter, just like she was in competition with her own sister, right? But in this case, this is her prepubescent daughter. Like, she's 10, like, insane. So we're kind of getting from like severe insecurity into actual mental illness at this point, which is a really crazy thing to sort of see happen. And as a way of sort of justifying her jealousy and hatred of her own daughter, she starts telling the other kids that Susan is possessed by a demon, or that Chet has made her a witch, and that this has to be beaten out of her. So she and Chet are married for like not even 6 months. He bails out real quick. And after that, Theresa sort of spirals out. She gives up on finding a man, and instead she starts drinking even more heavily, and also starts gaining a ton of weight. Now, instead of taking any sort of personal responsibility for this monster of a woman blames her daughter Susan for cursing her, saying that she's casting spells on her, she's a demon, and that's why Theresa is gaining all of this weight. Now, to be clear, Theresa had always beaten all of her kids pretty regularly, and not necessarily for any good reason, but around this time, she really goes off the deep end and kicks the abuse into high gear. And it also becomes clear that Susan is her main target. And the abuse against Susan in particular ramps up very, very quickly. Now, for the next 8 or so years, Theresa becomes more abusive, more reclusive, and more horrible to her children. Now, at this time, they lived in a house in Orangevale, which is kind of in the Sacramento area, which is where much of this abuse took place. And during their time there, Theresa ended up pulling all of the kids out of school, turning off her phone, and not even allowing the kids to go outside. Susan loved school because she was smart. Like, she was 5 years ahead of all of her classmates. So she was the first one to be pulled out of school because Theresa wanted to do anything she could to like hurt her daughter, to like abuse her and, assert power and control over her. But eventually all the kids were out of school. And I guess this was okay because nobody was paying attention. So super fucking crazy. Now, after the kids are all out of school and the abuse is ramping up, like I said, she's really on Susan. And one of the reasons that she really hates Susan in particular is because while Theresa has gained so much weight, Susan is thin and pretty and shapely and just everything that Theresa wants to be. So one of the ways that she torments Susan is for 2 years straight, she is handcuffed to the dinner table. Now, she's allowed to go to the bathroom and get up occasionally, but she's literally handcuffed to the table and made to sleep under it. And during meals, Theresa has her stuck in her seat and is force feeding her. Now, she's force feeding her like mashed potatoes, fattening food, as anything she can to try to make Susan fatter so that Theresa doesn't have to feel so threatened by her. And she will not let her up from the table until she's done eating. It got to the point where on multiple occasions, Susan would throw up from being too full, and Theresa made her eat her own vomit. Her youngest daughter, Terry, once recalled Theresa forcing a spoon of food into Susan's mouth so forcefully that she chipped her tooth. So this is really, really gnarly, really fucking severe. And she would do this in front of all the other kids. She would also beat the children with a paddle. And what's worse, she would make them hold each other down while she did it. So she was normalizing not only being abused, but also teaching the children to be abusive to each other, even though they were all they had in the whole world because they were isolated from everyone else. She was forcing them to harm one another on a daily basis, which is so fucked up. Now, after many years of this, when Susan was around 16 years old, she tried to run away. Unfortunately, truancy police found her fairly quickly, which is funny because they didn't notice she wasn't in school, but they arrest her for being not at home, right? Interesting. And at first, she was taken to a mental hospital because she was so terrified of going home, and police found her to be hysterical, which she likely was with very good reason. But from here, they end up taking her back home, and they interview the other children with Theresa in the room to see if Susan was telling the truth about the abuse. Now, despite the children, for the most part, being very clearly malnourished, not including Susan, being dirty, not being in school, child quote-unquote protective services chose to believe Theresa that there was no abuse and believed the children when they denied abuse because their mom is in the room with them, and returned Susan to her home. After the social workers left, and I mean immediately after, Theresa made each of her other 5 children punch Susan in the stomach as hard as they could. And if they didn't hit her hard enough, she made them do it again. So now the children are seeing that they really truly are on their own. Nobody's going to help them, and this is just the way life is. Susan straight up went to the police, and they just returned her to her mother, which is just fucking crazy. Now, as I said, the kids are all normalizing this abuse, and at one point, Howard supposedly sexually abused one of his sisters, or 2 of his sisters, I'm not sure. What I do know is that when Theresa found out, she beat the living shit out of him, and it never happened again, but like, who's surprised by this? I should also mention that he was able to find the time to do this because while the children were locked in the house all day, Theresa had a full-time job working as a caretaker for the elderly, which is terrifying. But what's interesting is she had such a hold on these kids that she could leave for hours on end and they would just stay put because they were that afraid. They would just do her bidding. Like, she's one woman and there are 6 of them, but she has such a hold on these children that they are just living in such fear that they do whatever she says, which is so scary and so sad. And things, to be clear, like Susan was bearing the brunt, but things were not just bad with her. At one point, Theresa took a gun, because of course she had one, and put it to Terry's head, threatening to kill her by saying, "I shot one, I'll do it again." Terry wasn't even 10 years old, I don't think, at the time, and she later recalled that she was left with a bruise on her temple after this interaction. So the years continue to go by, and like I said, Susan's 16, tried to run away, but still, thin and pretty. She's locked to the table, and her mom's pissed. So like I said, she had her locked to the dinner table for 2 fucking years with a gag in her mouth, as a matter of fact. And finally, one night, after Susan's just begging, "Please let me go, please let me up, please let me get away," Theresa has the brothers, uncuff her. But only so her 2 brothers can hold her down. I should mention Howard had moved out at this point because he was 20 and he's like, fuck this crazy house. But the 2 remaining, William and Robert, hold her down. And then they pick her up to move her into another room. And while they do this, Theresa pulls out a gun and shoots Susan. This shocked everyone, including Theresa, who I don't really think realized that she was actually going to shoot her own daughter. And after she did, Susan screamed and fell to the ground with blood gushing out of her chest. Theresa immediately sprang into action, not to save her child, but to save her own ass. by throwing Susan into the bathtub while instructing her children to clean up the blood all over the kitchen floor and walls that resulted from the shooting. Now, believe it or not, Susan did not die from this wound, at least not directly, and we'll get there. She lived in that tub for weeks until she was finally strong enough to rejoin the family. And during this time, Theresa was feeding her random Tylenol and antibiotics that she just happened to have and just hoping that she didn't die because she wasn't going to take her to the fucking hospital. But somehow, miraculously, Susan did in fact recover. And as soon as she was recovered, Theresa was back to abusing her horribly. And this was despite Susan, who had always sort of talked back to her mom a little bit, probably because of how horribly she was abused. This was despite her sort of changing her ways and being on her best behavior and trying not to poke the bear, because obviously she knows her mom will in fact kill her. So she's, trying to be good, but didn't really make a difference. Now, as I'd mentioned, Theresa loved to drink, and even during this time, she would often go out drinking. And one night, she came back in a really good mood. Usually, she'd come home drunk and beat the shit out of her kids. But in this instance, she comes home and she's happy. This was about a year after the shooting, and Susan, now 17, saw her chance and decided to ask Theresa to please let her leave home. She told Theresa she wanted to go to Alaska and start over, and that Theresa would never have to see her again if she just let her leave. She knew the idea of never seeing Susan again would make Theresa really happy, and she was right. Theresa considered this for a while, but eventually said, "Yes, Susan, you can leave." But, she said, before Susan was able to leave the house, she had to let Theresa remove the bullet from her back so she couldn't go to the police and have Theresa arrested for abuse. Which right here shows that no matter how mentally ill Theresa was, she knew what she was doing and she knew it was wrong and she did things to keep from getting caught. So when people talk about whatever mental illness she was going through, which was obviously very severe, she still had the presence of mind to know what she was doing was wrong and she was doing it anyway. Anyway, Susan really didn't want to do this. Like, who wants to allow their crazy drunk mother to cut them open with a fucking knife? But she thought it was the only way to get away from her mother, so she agreed to do it. So we're now sometime in like mid-June 1984, and Susan's like, "Okay, dig it out, Mom." So she's given like a fifth of whiskey, I believe, which she drinks all of, plus a bunch of pills to make her fall asleep, because of course Theresa has access to all of this. And she goes out like pretty hardcore, like she's passed the fuck out. And while she's out, Theresa grabs a fucking X-Acto knife and starts cutting into Susan's back, going deeper and deeper, but never able to find the bullet. Finally, she made one of her sons, I don't know if it's William or Robert, but she makes one of them dig his fingers inside his own sister's back, and finally he's able to find and remove the bullet. Now, Susan should be waking up the next morning and hopefully healing, but she doesn't. She didn't wake up for most of the following day, and when she did finally come to, it was clear that something was very, very wrong. Susan was in and out of consciousness, was not able to form words, and was not able to control her bowels. Her mother again tried to heal her at home, definitely refusing to take her to the hospital and just trying to pump her full of antibiotics, but things only got worse and worse. Her back turned black with internal bleeding and rotted skin. She had a terrible fever, and she just laid on the floor in diapers for weeks. Theresa refused to allow her siblings to help her at all, so the entire family would just walk over her body as she lay there dying. Finally, after weeks of this horrific, nightmarish scene, Theresa's like, "Fuck this, she's gonna die, let's just get rid of her." So on July 16th, 1984, I believe, 1984, she gets her sons to duct tape Susan's hands together, put duct tape over her mouth because she had been like sort of just randomly screaming in pain, which is fucking horrific. And she throws Susan in the car, puts the brothers in the car, and makes them go out driving. Now, they end up driving for a few hours up to Squaw Valley, which is like a really popular ski resort in the area, but it's summertime, so at that point, it was pretty desolate out there. She takes them, which is another bit of proof that she knew what she was doing. She was trying to hide the body. So she takes them out to a wooded area, has them dump Susan on the ground, and then you're like, okay, she's just going to leave her dying body there. No, it does not end there. Once Susan was on the ground, Theresa pulled out a fucking gas can from the car and poured gasoline all over Susan's body. She then said to her sons, "Light her up." The two did as they were told and lit Susan's still alive body on fire. It was later determined that she died from smoke inhalation because she was still alive when her brothers lit her on fire with gasoline at their mother's order. And I want to say also that when her body was found, which it was, the very next day, she was in a partial boxer's pose, which if you guys know what that means. So when somebody is burned alive, even after they're pretty much not conscious anymore, their arms will automatically kind of curl up in front of them. So they look like an old-timey boxer, like putting their hands out to fight. And so this is something that only happens when a body is burned alive. And so this is often a telltale sign that the person was still alive when they were set on fire, which is a really fucked up thing to know. And now all of you know if you didn't already. So she was found the next day by a hiker. And while police did everything they could to figure out who she was, they took her fingers for fingerprints. They got her teeth in hopes of like dental records. She went on to be a Jane Doe for a very long time. Now that Susan was dead, Theresa, of course, didn't learn anything or stop her crazy behavior, and instead she turned her hatred to Sheila, who was now 20 years old and still afraid to leave home. She told her other children that now Sheila was possessed by a demon, because of course she was, and the torture against Sheila was just as bad as it had been for Susan, although it was very different. Beyond the regular beatings, Theresa forced Sheila into sex work to make money for her. Which I should mention that they moved after Susan died, I think to avoid suspicion since there was suddenly one less minor in the house. So they stayed in the general area, but they moved actually into Sacramento. So now they're living in an apartment, and Sheila is being forced to do sex work to make money to help pay the bills. And what's so fucking twisted about this is that Sheila actually enjoyed the sex work because she was able to get out of the house and away from her mother. And not only that, but Theresa was so happy with the amount of money coming in that she basically just let Sheila do whatever she wanted. At least for a very short amount of time. Pretty quickly, things sour again when Theresa finds out that she has an STD. Now, Theresa has decided that she got this from Sheila because they shared a toilet, which... You're an idiot, Theresa. That's not how that fucking works. And also, the only reason Sheila would have an STD is because you're forcing her into sex work. So who's really to blame here? In any case, she decides that Sheila gave her the STD, and she also decides that Sheila must be pregnant. And she's so fucking pissed about this, even though, once again, none of this would have happened if she wasn't being forced into sex work. But in Theresa's twisted fucking mind, this is Sheila's fault. So she beats the shit out of Sheila. And after she beats the shit out of her, she hog ties her and throws her in a tiny closet in their apartment. Now, there is no airflow in this closet. It's just a dark hole. And it's hot because it's now the middle of summer. It's about a year after Susan died. And Sheila is now being locked in a fucking hole, which is so fucked up. Or in a closet, but in like a dark, nasty place. Sheila was crying and begging to be let out, but Theresa forbade the children from helping her, and they were also afraid of Theresa that they just listened. Eventually, Sheila had to use the restroom, but because she wasn't allowed out, she wet herself. And after being left in there without food or water for a few days, she was covered in her own urine and feces, was dehydrated, and became too weak to even cry out for help. She was left in the closet for just over a week, and after a few days, her siblings could hear her starting to hallucinate from lack of sustenance. They heard her say something like she was going toward the light, then heard a climbing sound, and then a loud thud on the floor. Now, prior to this, a day or two into this, Terry had actually opened the door to help Sheila, giving her a drink of beer because that was the only thing nearby, because of course it was, and she was trying to help her before Theresa came back home. But as she was trying to like help her get hydrated, Theresa came home, so she had to close her back in the closet and not help her anymore. And Terry later said this was the last time she saw her sister alive. After the thud on the floor, the children never heard another sound out of the closet and only checked on their sister a few days after this because it had started to smell. Sheila Gay Sanders died age 21 on June 21st, 1985, less than a year after her sister Susan was murdered by their mother. So these two died within a year of each other. I hesitated on the 1985 because I might have said that's when Susan died, but she died in 1984. I apologize if I got that wrong. But anyway, they were both killed within a year of each other by their fucking crazy ass mom. After Sheila died, Terry and her two sons put her in a cardboard box and drove her out and dumped her somewhere in the woods. Now again, Sheila was found pretty quickly, but they were not really able to identify her body. So she once again was another Jane Doe. Now from here, things go a little fucking sideways. It's just Theresa does not, once again, she's not like learning anything from this, and she's actually, getting worse, continuing to get worse. So Theresa's completely out of her mind. She decides the smell and the stains in the closet from Sheila's bodily fluids would get the family caught. I should also mention that when she burned Susan alive, she also burned all evidence of her ever being alive, including all photos of her, which is why if you go online, you only see one photo of Susan. It's because it was in a yearbook. So she couldn't get rid of it. But there's literally no other photos of Susan anywhere, which is crazy. So in this case, she again decided to use fire to solve her problems and instructed her youngest daughter, Terry, the only one still alive, to light their house on fire to burn away the smell and stains in the closet. Terry did as she was told, but the fire was barely catching when neighbors called for help. The fire was extinguished within minutes and the evidence remained, but luckily for them, nobody at the time seemed to notice it and the family was off the hook, at least for now. From here, Theresa decided to move the family since their apartment was now destroyed, and Terry saw her chance to get away from her mother once and for all. Now, I should say also that police believed the fire was set intentionally, but once again, they couldn't find proof. So Theresa is just like getting away left and right. Like she's just so lucky. And I hate that. But anyway, so she's like, damn, I don't want to push my luck. Time to move. She decides, we're going to move away. Now, William, who I believe was then around 21, took off and started his life away from his mom. And Terry wanted to do so as well. So she took her sister Sheila's ID to show she was of age and convinced her mom to let her go after burning down the apartment, or trying to. She was basically like, yes, mom, I will burn down the apartment, but after this, you need to let me move out. Now, Terry was only 14 at the time, but Sheila was 20. So she took Sheila's ID and apparently looked enough like her to use it and got away from her mom. So Terry took off to Utah, while Theresa and Robert, who was 19, went to Vegas, which really makes a lot of sense. Vegas, Sin City, it's perfect for Theresa. It makes sense that's where she'd go. Now, after a few years, Robert was jailed for murder, which shouldn't be surprising for anyone. I've read conflicting things. One, that he killed someone in a bar fight, and the other was that he shot a bartender during a robbery. But either way, he was given 16 years for second-degree murder. And what I mean by it shouldn't be surprising is that considering the life these children have lived, of course they're going to be getting into trouble. So while I don't necessarily blame them, they're also not going to be like upstanding citizens necessarily. At least Robert wasn't. Now from here, Theresa also moves to Utah, and she and Terry both ended up living in Salt Lake City, but not knowing the other was there. Over the years, Terry actually went to police with her story, but they straight up did not believe her, which I'm so beyond sick of hearing. She also told a therapist who also did not believe her and is like, what are these people for? Like, police are saying your story's too crazy, we don't believe you. And I'm like, do you guys not like pay attention or do research about your own job? Like, yes, this is crazy, but it's not that crazy. It's not out of the realm of possibility. Like true crime as like podcasts and stories, like these exist because there's so much craziness. So like, how are police so consistently so useless? Like, and therapists too? Like, what's going on here? It's so crazy. Finally, in 1993, so we're like 8 years after the last murder, she called America's Most Wanted after watching an episode, and they told her to contact the Placer County Police where Susan's body had been dumped. And I want to say over the years, I've heard other podcasts talking about this, and everybody calls it Placer County because it's spelled Placer. But I'm from California, so you get the benefit of my knowledge on these cases. It is Placer County. So Susan's body had been dumped in Placer County, so she called Placer County Police and gave a super detailed account of both Susan and Sheila's murders, and it was so convincing that these police actually believed her, but also probably because they had the bodies to match the story. Now, within days of Terry calling Placer County, both of her brothers were arrested. William, while working in Woodland, California, which is about 15 miles from Sacramento and also where I was born, and Robert was already in prison, so that was easy. Theresa, on the other hand, was a little bit harder to find, but finally police tracked her down in Salt Lake City after finding a recent arrest record for drunk driving. Theresa had been going by her maiden name of Theresa Cross and was working as a caretaker for her landlord's 85-year-old mother. When police knocked on her door, she didn't put up a fight, but she did try to run out the back, and it was clear she had been packing for an escape, as she had definitely heard about her son's arrests on the news. At first, Theresa fought extradition to California and planned to plead not guilty on all counts, but after hearing her son Robert was going to testify against her, she gave in and agreed to a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. She was sentenced to 2 life sentences with the possibility of parole, for which she was denied in 2019. Her son Robert was given 3 years for his part in the murders to be served consecutively with his own sentence, and William was given probation, which I honestly think is fair. He had stayed entirely out of trouble since leaving his childhood home and was very much a victim in this case, I believe. Now, Robert, unfortunately, who I also believe was a victim, was given 8 years in 2016 for possession of child pornography, which is just the saddest shit to me because these kids never stood a chance. Now, Terry, the youngest, actually had a pretty okay life. She was married twice, but very unfortunately died at the very young age of 41 from a heart ailment. She had a Facebook page where she'd begun writing about her trauma and her life story, and I actually used some of it for this story, but unfortunately she never finished her writing as her death was very sudden and unexpected. Theresa Knorr, unfortunately, is still alive, but rotting away in a prison in Chino, California, where she absolutely belongs forever. She will be eligible for parole in 2027, which I'm sure she will be denied. And I gotta say, I hope she dies before then anyway, because fuck her. It was so bad that even though her daughters were found within a day of being dumped, they were both so disfigured and horrifically treated that even after Theresa was arrested for their murders, they were never able to positively identify either body. They only went off of Terry's testimony, the son's testimony, and Theresa admitting to killing them. Like, they couldn't even identify the bodies. Like, that's how fucked up all of this was. So fuck this woman forever. She's a total piece of shit. I'm glad she's rotting. And I actually, I can't wait till my kid gets a little older so I can be like, at least I'm not Theresa Knorr when he's telling me what a terrible mother I am. Because I'm absolutely going to tell him this story. That's so fucked up. Not till he's a teenager, I promise. Anyway, thanks everybody for listening. Sorry there's more delays between episodes than I would like. Moving, internet, life, it's hard. I'll keep going though. You'll hear from me soon. And until then, everybody, stay safe.